Welcome at Heinrich-Böll Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's discussion event, Gaza is Starving and the World is Watching, which is part of our Böll.Global series. My name is Bauke Baumann. I'm Senior Program Officer in the Middle East Department of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I will moderate the discussion. Thank you for being with us via Zoom and Livestream. Wie Sie hören, spreche ich Englisch. Das wird die Hauptsprache unserer Veranstaltung sein. Sollten Sie Übersetzung benötigen, würde ich Sie bitten, den entsprechenden Kanal in Ihrem
The main language today will be English, but you can listen to the German translation, right?
The Gaza Strip that we used to know is completely collapsing. War has been raging for 19 months. More than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli strikes. Entire cities have been razed to the ground by Israeli bombs and bulldozers. The population of Gaza is being displaced to ever smaller areas. And above all, more than 2 million Palestinians are starving. Or, to put it more precise, they are being starved because humanitarian aid is blocked, politicized, and turned into a weapon of war. Israel's withholding of food, medicine, fuel, and water for over 2 months has further exacerbated the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. Major international aid organizations such as UNRWA and the World Food Programme are sounding the alarm. Their supplies are almost exhausted. Children have already starved to death. Thousands more are threatened with starvation if much more aid doesn't get into Gaza very soon, UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher said a few days ago. Meanwhile, the International Court of Justice is examining whether Israel's conduct of the war violates the Genocide Convention. Leading human rights organizations have already qualified the war in Gaza as genocide. Due to the mounting pressure on Israel, some aid is now coming in again, but it is not enough. It's a drop in the ocean. Additionally, Israel and the US just announced the kickoff for a new aid mechanism that will be run by a private foundation with the help of armed mercenaries, bypassing all established aid organizations in Gaza. However, the designated head of this new foundation has already resigned because he fears that the new mechanism undermines the principles of humanitarian aid. At the same time, the massive Israeli operations in the Gaza Strip continue and increase. Just yesterday, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, announced that they want to occupy 75% of Gaza and clear it from Palestinians in 2 months. 2 million people are supposed to be concentrated in 3 separate zones, which together make up only about a quarter of Gaza. Even more radical plans come from Netanyahu's right-wing extremist coalition partners. Finance Minister Smotrich just said that Gaza will be entirely destroyed and its Palestinian population will leave in great numbers to third countries. Hamas, on the other side, has been severely weakened militarily, but is still there. The war is helping it to recruit new fighters. At the same time, more and more people in Gaza are openly showing their rejection of Hamas, including through demonstrations. But as long as the war continues, it will hardly be possible to build and strengthen political alternative to Hamas within Gaza. So the international criticism of the Israeli government is growing, given Israel's brutal war against Hamas, which looks more and more like a war against the entire population of Gaza, in particular with regards to the blockade of food, the strike against medical facilities, and the mass displacement. The original goal of the war, the defense of Israel after the terrible attack by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, and the liberation of the Israeli hostages, seem to be receding further and further into the background. Even the US president and the German chancellor, 2 of Israel's closest allies who have long defended the war in Gaza, are now having doubts about the proportionality of this war and its compliance with international law. So far, these new, more critical words from Israel's allies have done little to change European or US policy on Israel, and not on the situation of the people in Gaza. And that's what we want to talk about today. It is time for action, time for demands and admonitions to be translated into concrete policy so that the people in Gaza do not continue to starve, so that they have a perspective for a life in peace, freedom, and dignity. And I'm very happy to present you now the panelists of today's event. I would kindly ask you all to turn on your cameras. Welcome to our 4 panelists, a very warm welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. I will briefly introduce the 4 of them, and then we jump straight into the discussion. After the discussion on the panel, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask our guests questions via the Q&A tool in your Zoom window. You're also welcome to send us your questions already during the discussion. So first, I would like to introduce Bushra Khalidi from Oxfam Palestine. Welcome. She's Oxfam's policy lead based in Ramallah, working intensely on Oxfam's operations in Gaza. Before that, she has been working with Save the Children International. While her current work focuses mainly on advocacy, Bushra has also been legal researcher. She has studied law, politics, and development studies in Sussex. Welcome. Secondly, I want to present Mayrav Sonstein from the International Crisis Group. She is senior analyst for Israel and Palestine. Mayrav is an Israeli-American journalist and commentator who has covered Israeli politics and US foreign policy for over a decade. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, and many other international newspapers. She has an MA in Nationalism Studies from the Central European University in Budapest. Welcome. My next guest is Simon Ilse. He currently heads the Heinrich-Böll Foundation's office in Ramallah on an interim basis and is also responsible for the program work of the Foundation's Human Security Unit in Vienna. Previously, Simon was heading the office in Belgrade of the Foundation and working in the Foundation's office in Tunis. Simon studied international relations and international law in Dresden, New Delhi, and London. Welcome. And finally, I'm delighted to present Boris Mijatovic, who is a member of the German Parliament for the Green Party. His focus of work are policies related to humanitarian aid and human rights. As MP, he has been visiting Israel and Palestine several times. Before his career as MP, he has been working a lot on international criminal law, amongst others with the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Welcome, Boris. And now let's get started. I would like to start today's discussion with some impressions from Gaza, because even though we follow the news, know roughly the numbers of dead and displaced people, it's somewhat different to get a vivid picture of people's everyday lives, their struggle for survival, and their unmeasurable suffering. Therefore, I would like to ask you, Bushra, to give us a brief snapshot of people's reality in Gaza. What is it like in Gaza right now? What are the biggest challenges for the people?
Thank you for having me today. I'm not only a humanitarian worker, but I'm also Palestinian. So I'm living here in the West Bank. I'm speaking to you from Ramallah. And also my husband's family is all in Gaza, but also all my colleagues. It's been nearly 600 days now since 7th of October, and Gaza really is just facing, you explained it, Bauke. It's unprecedented what we've seen, and all humanitarian workers that have worked in different parts of the world, including all the doctors that we send into Gaza, have said it's the worst humanitarian crisis that we've ever witnessed. Just to talk a little about the kind of intensified operations by Israel in the last couple of weeks, where it's basically, like you said, fragmented and carved the Gaza territory into these controlled compartments through east-west corridors, with evacuation orders really that are now affecting 80% of Gaza's territory. I mean, when we couldn't think about people being forcibly displaced over and over again. This is basically the daily life of people in Gaza. We have colleagues that have been displaced multiple times in the last 2 to 3 weeks. My family 7 times in the last 3 weeks. The bombardments are relentless and constant, and that's what everybody in Gaza are saying. And we're not seeing this on TV. We're not seeing how widespread and systematic the bombardments are across the Strip because there are no journalists and there's nobody covering it. The human toll, as you said, continues to just mount dramatically. At least 600 Palestinians were killed during the 20th and 26th of May. It's become a norm for hundreds of Palestinians to be massacred with zero accountability in a period of days. And so it's brought the cumulative death toll to over 53,000. But the thing is that this number doesn't even represent what, like, people dying from disease, the people that are disappeared under the rubble, the people that are not making it to the hospital because they can't make it to the hospital because they either don't have the means or it's far, or there's no hospital because most hospitals in Gaza have been decimated. It really has been a systematic campaign by design to completely obliterate every sector that sustains life in Gaza. The education sector is non-existent for the last two years. There are some informal kind of schooling in some of the UNRWA shelters, but beyond that, children have been out of school for 2 years in Gaza, and this, children in Gaza make up half of the population in Gaza. Daily casualty rates now are averaging about 70 deaths per day. That's become the new norm in Gaza, with single incidents producing 15 to 40 fatalities as Israeli strikes continue to target IDP shelters and residential areas, and not to, of course, forget the bombing and complete emptying of the northern governorates and the ethnic cleansing campaign that has occurred in the north for the last months, even before the ceasefire. Gaza's healthcare, like I said, is completely collapsed. 95% of hospitals have been damaged or are non-functional. And Al-Auda hospital, the last semi-operational facility in the north of Gaza, was repeatedly hit, leaving actually 700,000 people without surgery access when people need it the most. And now we're seeing patients facing 30 to 40 kilometer journeys with no cars, no roads, no fuel, through active combat zones just to reach, for example, at Shifa University. So for people from the north, this is a death sentence. The humanitarian response, as you have all seen, I mean, we are also on the edge of erasure, and battling basically every single day systematic Israeli obstruction. In the 5-day window last week, only 121 trucks, a few hundred trucks entered, and widespread looting, as we expected, of the aid convoys, reflected the growing desperation. I just want to talk to you about what some of the stories that we're hearing. We're hearing moms basically skipping meals for 3 days in a row so that they can feed their children. We're hearing of people slaughtering horses. It's sacred. That is like it's the most sacred animal in Islam. It goes about against everything we believe in our culture, to slaughter a horse to eat. We're seeing people catch sea turtles. We're seeing mothers boil leaves and boil grass to just put something in their children's stomach. We're seeing kids, skin on bones, dying of starvation. Starvation, also this idea that starvation is fixed by food only. That's not what starvation means. When you are suffering from starvation, you don't need just a bag of flour. You don't need just a little bread. You need the nutrients. You need a doctor. You need mental health support. Your family needs mental health support. All of those systems that the humanitarian kind of community has developed over decades of expertise is slowly being dismantled before our eyes in the silence of the world. I can go on. I mean, food production in Gaza is completely seized. There's no farmlands. Oxfam, a big program of Oxfam is rehabilitating farmlands, working with farmers, providing them with seeds and inputs in order to grow, so that the people can grow their own food, not only just throwing food at prisoners in a cage. That's basically what we have ended up doing now. It's prisoners in a cage that they can't leave, they can't go anywhere. There's no infrastructure infrastructure to sustain life. And then we think that the fix is a humanitarian box of food. It's much more complex than that. And we've developed incredible systems. And now Israel's militarization plan is undermining everything that we've built. And that works, by the way, when the
We'll
conditions.
later on go deeper into this
Yeah,
new
sure.
aid mechanism.
So
But thank you
I'll
so
stop
much
there.
for giving us already
Thank you,
a
Becca.
horrible snapshot of what life is like in Gaza, and how difficult to impossible it is for you as Oxfam and other humanitarian organizations to cater for the people's needs. Let's have a look on the other side, or maybe not the other side, but on the Israeli side. Mayraf, could you maybe walk us a little bit through the Israeli perspective on Gaza and help us to understand how average Israeli citizens would look at the war? So especially like how have the debate on the war in Gaza developed since the ceasefire was broken in March? So especially also what role do the hostages, but also the suffering of Palestinian civilians play in the discourses you hear or you follow in Israel?
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to say that, I think it's very difficult for Bushra to do her job and to present in words. Like I don't know if we have the words anymore to describe what's happening there. And she and I live, very, very close to Gaza. And it's just it's a failure of words. And so I appreciate your effort to convey it. Did you want me to talk about the internal conversation in Israel, or did you first want me to talk about the way that Israel's leadership understands the offensive first? Because I'm not sure if maybe that would be more helpful.
I would come later maybe to what the rationale behind
Okay.
the operation. I would now be especially curious how it's perceived that the suffering in Gaza is so intense, and
Sure.
we see that there have been statements from Yagolan on killing babies or others, something that was perceived as new in Israel and sparked quite some debates, if I'm right informed.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are in a moment where, for the first time since the war started, that you're starting to hear about starvation in Gaza, that you're starting to hear about the death toll, especially children. I mean, 9 children of the same family were killed in a drone strike, and that actually made headlines. It was actually spoken about on the evening news, which is a rarity in Israel. There really has been no coverage of the suffering in Gaza, and so there's a combination of factors that I think led to this moment. It doesn't necessarily represent a shift in policy at all, but there's definitely some more internal debate happening. And this is, of course, primarily external factors, but also internal factors. So, Israel basically was forced into the ceasefire that lasted for 2 months in January, and then it chose to break that ceasefire in March. And the right-wing government and the Israeli public at large, for the most part, was very, very, excited and waiting for Trump to come in and to kind of let it do whatever it wants in Gaza. And in some ways, that's exactly what has happened. But in a really kind of paradoxical way, Trump came in and forced the ceasefire, and then Israel broke it, and Trump continued to give Israel all the weapons and all the legitimacy that it needed. And at the same time, Israeli reservist soldiers, the former security elite in Israel, started to warn that the resumption of the offensive, which started in March, and now what we have is another kind of Gaza operation that was approved in May. But these steps to go back into Gaza, to give up on the hostage deal and the negotiations to end the war, have been widely criticized in Israel by, again, the top security elite. All the people who have dedicated their lives to Israeli security have come out against this, both for security military reasons, but also for domestic political reasons, because they believe Netanyahu is prosecuting this war to stay in power and to appease the far right, who seek to completely cleanse Gaza of Palestinians and resettle Gaza. And that is the trajectory that we're on. But the combination of reservist soldiers who have already served for 100, 200, 300 days at a time in Gaza, understanding that they're not going to get this military operation is not going to get the hostages out. It's going to endanger other soldiers' lives. It's going to kill a lot more Palestinians. I think people just started to put together the pieces of the puzzle, that this isn't it's not the same war that they thought that they started fighting on October 7th. And so the combination of that, plus the fact that Trump went to the Gulf countries and went on a trip and started to do all sorts of things that are completely unprecedented for Israeli-American relations, speaking directly to Hamas, getting the release of a soldier who is a dual American-Israeli citizen, Idan Alexander, getting him out completely as an American operation, and Israel was cut out of it. Unprecedented. It started, and then the Syria, lifting the sanctions on Syria, meeting with al-Shara, all these, and then the Houthi ceasefire. There's a lot of different regional components to how Trump has started to act that have made Israelis feel very concerned that Netanyahu is no longer the statesman that everybody thought he was, and that he doesn't have the US in his pocket anymore like he did with Biden. So these types of moves, together with the internal stuff, have really started to change the discourse. And then you have, of course, the European countries who have finally come out with much more clear statements. Now, it's still rhetoric, but it's rhetoric that we're not used to, plus the call to review the Association Council, and we can go into more details about certain steps. But effectively, what we're hearing from the German government in the last couple of days is something that we have never heard before, and really putting the spotlight on the fact that no matter how much these countries support Israeli security, this has gone too far, and that they no longer even understand what the purpose of this current offensive is, other than just hurting people in Gaza. And we've seen also that the strongest army in the Middle East has not been able to defeat Hamas in the way that it has promised. So this kind of loop of endless promises of total victory, and then seeing that this isn't happening, and instead what's happening is the total destruction of Gaza. And I think the main impetus for this shift is the fact that, the military in Israel is in a total tension with the political echelon since October 7th, since before October 7th, with the judicial overhaul protests and the fear of many secular liberal Israelis. And many secular liberal Israelis are the ones who are serving in the military. They are concerned that Israel is no longer even concerned about the facade of democratic values and international law. They're very, very concerned, also, soldiers, of being incriminated for war crimes. And so these things it's not out of empathy for Palestinians, but rather out of a concern for their own futures. That is really the impetus here. And I think at this point, because of just the egregious nature of how long it's lasted and how little it's achieving, I think more and more Israelis are starting to realize and talk about it.
Thank you very much for giving us an insight into the Israeli debate. Simon, I want to come to you, and maybe just as Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we are committed to human rights and international law worldwide, but in particular, this is true for our Ramallah office and the Palestinian partner organizations with whom we work. We support in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also in Gaza, local NGOs that document human rights violations by Israel, but as well by Hamas and the PA, and that campaign at international level for the strengthening of mechanisms of international law. So maybe, Simon, you could maybe put us a bit in the shoes of our partner organizations in Palestine. How are they doing in the light of the current developments, and especially what can they still do to defend the rights and also the dignity of people in Gaza right now?
Yeah, thank you, Bauke. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the very rich inputs by Bushra and Marav before. So I think, first of all, our partner organizations in Gaza, they're doing what everybody else in Gaza is doing. They're trying to survive, obviously. And I have to say, from the very start, I mean, I have utter admiration and respect for organizations like Oxfam, for which Bushra works, and our partner organizations in Gaza that are still active, working day in, day out to improve life conditions for Gazans. So we are, as you said, we're based in Ramallah with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and so we have different partner organizations in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. 4 of them are in Gaza and are still in Gaza. And when the war on Gaza started on October 7th, they completely shifted their work immediately to provide support. And we have we have, of course, a different posture and a different mandate as humanitarian organizations. We are a political foundation, so we have a different way of working, of course. But one thing we can do with our partners, like for example, Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, is to document human rights violations. And they're doing that in forms of testimonies about evictions, multiple displacements, access to or lack of access to basic services and needs like water. They're also doing and using this evidence of war crimes and human rights violations on the international level. So Al-Mizan is also presented evidence at the UN in Geneva on the Committee on the exercise of the rights of the Palestinian people, and also in the ICJ.
I think the connection cut, Simon. Can you hear us?
Partners is psychosocial support. So, for example, psychosocial support groups for women that are victims of human rights violations, the violations against their reproductive health, mothers who lost their kids because of lack of treatment, and so on. And this can take groups. This can take the form of group or individual counseling sessions, for example. Another focus is, for example, domestic violence in shelters. So that's about much more inward looking, not so much international dimension of the work. So this is really classic protection and community work. For example, working with youth on alternative dispute resolution within the community, enhancing the role of women in reconstruction committees, which is, I think, very impressive and shows you a little bit also that Gazans are still, despite everything, thinking about the future and about the day after this war, and about how to reconstruct Gaza afterwards, and what role and participatory role they can play in reconstructing Gaza. So this is another part of our work, building these local community leaders and trying to just be of support. But I have to say, of course, I'm myself stunned of how much they can still actually do the work and stick to it in these difficult circumstances, with the little internet coverage they have, the little battery life they have, and they're still, despite everything, they're still doing it. And yeah, respect.
Thank you, Simon, for also giving a picture of how how courageous NGOs in Gaza are still continuing their work, and not only on humanitarian work, but also on many other fronts. Being much more courageous than many politicians in Europe, so to say. And this brings me to Boris, not because I think you are courageous, but maybe you're not like many others. So to start with, the assessment of the warfare in the Gaza Strip vary greatly depending on to whom you talk. So the discrepancy between the German and the Palestinian discourse is particularly striking, but even the Israeli debate, I would say, is in many ways more critical and nuanced, at least in some niches, than the German one. With this in mind, would like ask you, Boris, how do you assess the Israeli army's operations in Gaza, and particularly the blockade of aid supplies that has lasted over 2 months? Is this a war crime?
The answer is very short. Yes, it is. And the question is, how big is the war crime? The term of systematic and widespread attempt has been taken already. So this is a crime against humanity. And this is what is on the table as a charge in The Hague in the ICC. But let me start first with 3 other remarks that might describe my work a little. When I started here on humanitarian aid in 2021, I was one of the first who had an appointment request from UNRWA, from Philip Lazzarini, and nobody really wanted to talk to him and meet him. And I said, well, it's a UN organization. It has, I don't know, 30,000 workers in Gaza, in Jordani, in Syria, in other places, in the West Bank, of course. So we need to talk. We need to talk about the goals, the work, etc. You remember all the debates on school books and everything that happened. So I met him right before 7th of October. And that's the second remark we shall not forget. And I think we all agree upon that these 58 hostages still in hostage by Hamas shall be released. And we need a ceasefire. We need always to highlight that this kind of situation is still going on. 58 people are still hostage by Hamas. And my last remark goes, a newspaper here in Germany yesterday lined up by saying Gaza is the fastest catastrophe, but it's by far not the largest. If we look on Sudan in Zamzam camp, where RSF just bombed them, or if we look in Myanmar, where just happened an earthquake. So I have two things to say. One is to look at Gaza itself, what the blockade means, how people die of starvation. It's not that people die of starvation, but they die of the diseases they get. They die of bad hygienic situations. They die of lack of medical aid. They die of, I don't know, weaknesses, whatever things you might imagine. That's one thing. But the bigger question is, how does our humanitarian aid system can survive in the UN level? And these kind of challenges that we have seen with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that has started working. Seriously, I love pictures of people carrying boxes, but that is not the amount we're talking about. We talk about dual-use goods to fuel, let's say, bakeries, for example. You cannot run a bakery when you don't have fuel. And when you need fuel, you're in debates with Kogart if that is a dual-use good. Yes, it is. And what do you do with it, etc. So there is a lot of open questions to the humanitarian aid situation, especially to the system. So one of the main challenges, or one of the main demands I have to my German government is, please try to make clear the red lines with the Israeli government, what they cannot do, and they cannot block and take hostage an entire society with more than 2 million people. That is not self-defense. That is not what we expect. We need access. We need humanitarian corridors, and we don't need a replacement of UN aid organizations like UNICEF, like World Food Programme, etc. Then we come to more detailed questions. When we talked about UNRWA in the last 1.5 years, it was like UNRWA is in the situation, you have read the Colonna report, there have been charges against 9 workers of, I don't know, out of 3,500 that have been claimed to be assisting Hamas, etc. But UNRWA has been unreplaceable in the humanitarian aid work. Today, it is forbidden for UNRWA to travel in Israel itself. It has to, let's say, replace the headquarters in East Jerusalem. And when you talk today to the World Food Programme, they say, okay, today we have managed to replace the work of UNRWA. We can do the trucks. And now we talk about size. Someone talked about, I don't know, 8 or 9 trucks that have been delivered. That's not the size that we're talking about. WFP just listed 10 days ago that they have 116,000 tons of goods, of food that can be delivered. To say it in trucks, that's about 3,000 trucks. It's my personal calculation. Please don't take me serious, but this is the size we're talking about. And this needs logistics, that needs drivers, that needs, I don't know, tire repair because of destruction, because what you see in Gaza is a completely destroyed country or place. And what you need is safe travel. And that means also that your tires need to be repaired if they got bombed. And you need, of course, security. And what comes to my mind is, why don't we start to launch this and request this more directly, more straightly from the Israeli government? Let me finish here. I have more to say, of course, but
we
I
are
would
going
like
into it in more detail in the second
Perfect,
chat
yes.
round. But thank you very much for being so clear. And yeah, I have to say, these are kind of words and voices that were rarely heard in Germany, also in the Green Party, I have to admit, in the last 2 years. But happy to see them coming more and more. Thank you.
But Bauke, can I just add this, because this challenge has been meeting me quite a few times in the last 3 years. Guys, we've been working in a humanitarian aid system for ages, and we have been seeing very difficult situations. And this situation is probably the most complex we have ever had. 2 million people suffering, starving, 2 months of blockade. But seriously, Bauke, we have been talking about this, and it was difficult because either you go this direction or you go that direction. As a United Nations system, you are in the middle of everybody. And I would like to say also that 400 dead health workers, humanitarian aid workers, more than 400, are a sign that we took care and that we tried to make a voice for them as well. Sorry, just I feel personally touched if you say it like that.
Thank you. This was not against you, but just observing how discourse is shifting, and I'm happy that it is, even if it might come too late and too slow, but it's coming, and this is good and important, I think. Bushra, coming back to you, we already mentioned this new aid mechanism by this private foundation that was now launched by Israel and the US. The idea is that it's distribution centers that are secured by armed mercenaries, and the idea is to bypass all established humanitarian organization. So maybe we can elaborate a bit on it. What's the intention of Israel and the US having these kind of centers or this new mechanism? And does it how does it work with humanitarian principles? And in the end, will it help the people on the ground? What's your assessment of this?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to all of the other interventions, which I mean, I agree with 100% and really well succinct. So I appreciate really listening to all of you. I mean, this system basically essentially gives Israel power over who receives the aid, where they receive the aid, and from whom they receive the aid, right? And it turns basically aid into this tool of coercion, right? You want the food, you have to come here. You want, you want a box, you want some flour, you need to meet us here. Basically blurring the line between what humanitarian assistance is and what a military objective is. I do not have this information. I've just received intel as we're speaking, and I've not had this verified yet, but there's already videos online of people storming into the first distribution center that's open today. And the American mercenaries have started shooting at them with American helicopters. And this is what we'll see. And I will remind you of an incident that happened a year ago called the Flower Massacre, where after a long period of siege, convoys escorted by military escorts entered Gaza, and people flooded those what's it called, those trucks, and they were basically massacred as they were desperately pulling flour from off the trucks because of starvation. We will see things like this happen because this system entirely undermines, because there's no transparency in the system. We don't know who they're accountable to. We don't know what their mandate is. We don't even know where they're registered. We don't know where their funding is from. So it lacks complete transparency. And to say that aid, this is basically to ensure that aid is not diverted. If anything, this will increase the risk of informal actors acting in Gaza. It will raise the risk of not just Hamas but other armed actors to basically profit from the situation. So this model that's floating around, it's not just dangerous for Gaza, because it basically creates camps or so-called logistic hubs. They've called it many things over the last year, but history has shown us that there's so much danger in forcing displaced population into a militarized area under the guise of protection, and that these areas basically risk becoming concentrated sites of control, not an actual sanctuary where Gazans can grieve in dignity, can get care in dignity. And in any case, this system only looks at food. It's only about the distribution of food boxes. And what I was saying in kind of my initial intervention is it has completely undermined international humanitarian law, because IHL protects civilians wherever they are. So we as humanitarian actors, it's not just about providing assistance to the population. It's about making sure that it is meeting their needs. And people across the Gaza Strip have different needs. Some are facing starvation. Some are facing starvation and injuries. Some are facing starvation and disease. Some are facing, they're orphaned and they've lost their parents or their entire family, and they're the only surviving member of their family. They will have different needs. So it's reduced basically all of our humanitarian intervention to a box of food that anyway cannot be cooked without water or fuel. So how do you also rehabilitate? And Boris, you've touched a bit about that. I mean, it is the decimation of entire sectors. How am I supposed to cook lentils without clean water and some firewood or gas? And that plan doesn't address those things. Internationally, and so moving aid into these fenced kind of supervised spaces under military or private contractor control, whatever it is, it really recalls some of the darkest chapters of humanitarian failure. And for us, aid must never be used to contain or to corral people. That's not protection, that's coercion. And so, of course, the majority of the humanitarian, the principled humanitarian actors that are in the occupied Palestinian territories and operating here will never support any model that would basically risk treating the Palestinian civilians as prisoners. Our responses are really guided by international law. They're voluntary, they're grounded in dignity, and they're delivered impartially, and they're not shaped by Israel's occupation or Israel's siege or Israel's military control.
Thank you so much for hammering out this point, which is, I think, very crucial, and it could be also a precedent for many other conflict areas once this would be the new normal for humanitarian aid. Going back to you, Mayrav, you pointed it out. I want to look a little bit on the elite discourse and to help us to understand what's the rationality of Israel's operations in the Gaza Strip, especially the intention of blocking aid. So officially, the idea is always, or it's said, the withholding of humanitarian aid is intended to weaken Hamas and to force it to give up. At the same time, we are hearing from people from the coalition government open calls for permanent expulsion of all Palestinians, for the annihilation of the whole strip. So what's your assessment of this contradictory messaging by the Israeli government, and what do Netanyahu and his government actually want to achieve in Gaza? Because either it seems to be very dark, or you could say completely unclear, but maybe you could enlighten us a little.
I mean, I think in some ways it depends who you ask. If you ask, the far right versus Netanyahu versus the military, you'll get somewhat different responses. I think what's important to keep in mind is that the consensus on this war is starting to break in Israel, but the consensus remains across the public and the political spectrum that Hamas has to be removed from power in Gaza. Now, what exactly that means is very different to different people, and you've heard military experts in Israel and in the US talk about how there is no military solution to guerrilla warfare or to a terror group like Hamas. So, in that sense, a lot of people, I think, with a brain on their shoulders, understand that the military course that Netanyahu is pushing, he keeps pushing it very clearly, that's going to defeat Hamas. But that is what Israel is looking to do. It's looking to remove Hamas from power in Gaza. He recently talked about specific demands for the war, to end the war, and that included the release of the hostages, exile of Hamas leaders, of which very few are left, and then the disarmament of Hamas and the implementation of the Trump plan. So in the beginning of the war, Netanyahu talked about that he won't occupy Gaza, and he said certain things that are obviously not true. Today, Israel is occupying Gaza. It was also occupying it to different extents before the war. And now you have a far-right government that is openly pushing for ethnic cleansing of Gaza. There's no really other way to look at it. Now, whether or not that ethnic cleansing can actually be implemented in the way that these Israeli leaders are talking about, I don't know. What I do know is that they've made Gaza unlivable. No person in their right mind who has a choice would want to live in the way that people are forced to live now in Gaza. So I mean, I would say that, it's also hard to say because there's on the one hand a strong majority of Israelis, for example, who would like to see the war end for a hostage deal and deal with Hamas later. But there's also a strong majority who have polled saying that they would be happy or they think it's a great solution to see most of Palestinians emptied out of Gaza. So and these polls are obviously problematic and it's hard to, but there is a consensus in Israel that we need to defeat Hamas in Gaza. So that has been the defining kind of determining force. And of course, the hostage crisis has been what the public has put the spotlight on. But I think that we have reached a moment where Israel has tied it did it from the beginning, but now it's coming to an inflection point where it has destroyed most of Hamas's military capabilities. Everybody agrees that Hamas cannot present a real threat to Israel like it did on October 7th. And today it really can't present any threat. And that its survival has been based on the fact that it's able to still govern and control the Strip to some extent. So what Israel claims to be trying to do now, and this is across the political spectrum, even in the opposition, they would all agree that Hamas's role in governing the Strip and controlling the aid needs to be severed. So that is how Israel has effectively used the issue of aid and kicking out UNRWA and all the attacks on the aid programs in order to say that, but we need to remove Hamas from the supply chain. Now, the argument that Israel has made is that Hamas is looting the aid, is stealing the aid, and then profiting from it. There is no evidence that anyone has seen that this has happened, and all the aid organizations have said that that's not true. Now, I'm sure in some cases that might be true, but it's not on any level that is systematic. And Israel hasn't provided in private or public evidence to anyone about it. So I don't know why Israel has chosen strategically to go on that line, because it's very transparent that that's not what's happening. But the line that Hamas has to be severed from the aid is a line that a lot of people have kind of gone with, and they continue to go with it. And I do think that, many people have said Netanyahu is pursuing this war, endless war, to stay in power. That's true. But I also think that there are people, Netanyahu included, people around him, military people, that really believe that if you just keep going a little more, a little further, and you kind of sever the population from Hamas somehow, I don't know how, that you will be able to defeat Hamas. So they still are going on this logic. I think a lot less people, certainly outside Israel, but also inside Israel, believe or buy it anymore. And I think Trump, and for his purposes, was hoping that Israel would be able to kind of get the job done, and it's just not happening. So we're in this kind of stalemate, and I think it's unfortunate that it's taken so long, but I think people are starting to realize that Israel's objectives are not going to be met in the way that they've portrayed it, and that it needs to stop.
Thank you very much. Now I want to jump back to Germany and with you, Simon. So the German debate about Gaza is sometimes almost detached from the developments on the ground and also from the debates in Israel and Palestine itself. The German debate, often the famine in Gaza is sometimes treated almost like a natural disaster whose cause is unclear, or the hunger and the violence are shrugged off and just justified by the complex situation or the perfidious strategy of Hamas. So maybe can you tell us a few points where you say these are points where we in Germany with our debate have to face the facts on the ground and be serious in a sense of open for new realities, open for what's happening on the ground? Where do you see the most important point that these changes or the shift that we are already seeing needs to accelerate or even change more?
Yeah, thank you. Big and difficult question, of course. And as you mentioned, or I think Bushra might have mentioned that things are shifting a little bit these days, and there's more concrete language now from the government. But honestly, it's also first of all, very late, but also too little given what Bushra actually described. So first of all, I would say, and contradict Boris a little bit on this point, this is a very obviously difficult and complex war and conflict, and it hasn't started on October 7th, right? I think we all agree on that. But what I would definitely urge everyone to kind of come on board with is that what we're facing now in the immediate moment, the humanitarian blockade of the Gaza Strip, is something not so difficult. It's very simple. There's an international legal obligation by the Geneva Conventions are crystal clear on this to give humanitarian aid access to the Strip. This is nothing that we should like kind of paint a picture of that this is so complex or difficult. And I think if we're talking about fuel for bakeries as a dual use good, then I think we have already lost the debate, because this is very, very clear. What's happening is a clear war crime, a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, and there's nothing difficult about this. The Israelis have to leave this humanitarian aid in. And
Simon, can I just jump in? Because you said you contradict.
Yes.
I completely agree to you. There is no contradiction.
Okay. Great.
My perception was the technical dialogues I had with Kogat on dual use. Sorry for that. That was a misunderstanding. You got me wrong.
Yeah.
But
all right.
On the rest, it was as clear as you are now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Boris. No, and I'm also glad that what Mayrav mentioned about the her very clear statement on the looting and so on, because honestly, this is exactly what Netanyahu and the far-right government of Israel wants us to debate. That's a false argument. It's a smokescreen debate. If you create such conditions as are being created right now, inhumane, unlivable conditions in Gaza, of course people are going to go and loot and are doing everything they can to get their hands on a bag of flour or on an apple or something, and so it's not the debate about if Hamas gets enriched or is like kind of selling and enriching itself with these humanitarian goods. It's a man-made starvation campaign and a humanitarian catastrophe, and it's also it's a political choice. It's the result of political choices, of course, first of all by Israel, but also by the international community that have for way too long stood by, including Germany and the EU, of course. And this goes as far back as the blockade of Gaza. Gaza is on an international sea and land blockade since 2007. That's not how you can create perspectives for 2.3 million people and think about going for a peace deal or peace process. That's not serious and realistic policy right there. So that is something that is one thing I wanted to make clear. And then very clearly, Bauke, because you asked about the German debate, I think everyone is very, very tired of the repeated statements and repeated appeals, and it's not enough anymore. Come on. We need political backing, political support, and for these statements, and you need to do something. You need to conditionalize this political backing of Israel, and of course, arms deliveries to Israel have to be on the table. Something else that is already on the table of the EU Foreign Ministers Council is to review the EU-Israel Association Agreement based on Article 2, the human rights dialogue right there. It's very clear also this has to be frozen, and this was something that has been already on the table last November. There apparently wasn't any consensus on this, but I very much hope that Germany can at least abstain for the vote when it is presented to them and not reject it again.
Thank you very much, Simon. And we're gonna continue. This is a perfect bridge to Boris, because the old government, but also the new government is like demanding that Israel complies with international humanitarian law, that it lets more aid into Gaza for months, but you hardly to see an effect, or you could also say you don't see any effect so far. So in your opinion, what are now the actions beyond the rhetoric that the current government needs to take? And Simon already delivered some bullet points. Maybe you could say, like, what do you see as the most important steps that Friedrich Merz and his government needs to undertake right now?
To be very clear, reopen humanitarian corridors, bring food in, bring medicine in, bring trucks in, bring fuel in, stop misusing humanitarian assistance by founding new foundations, try to enlarge the work of the UN system. So that's basically three things right now. But Bauke, I would like to emphasize also the work of Louise Amsberg and Annalena Baerbock in the last 1.5 years. We've been running around, literally running around, traveling around, asking. I can't tell how many times I've been talking about truckloads, how many trucks this day, that day, how many open gates, how many open access points, etc. Do we have to move from one truck to another the goods? Is that lists of medical aid dual use or not? Then you have second lists on the points themselves. Then there is not, don't get me wrong, but little soldiers that have own interpretations of this. So there's visa problems, there's access problems, there's tons of these little things. And that's why I mentioned the dual use issue, because all these little things are little screws in the system that doesn't work. And the obstruction of this system is something that we have seen has been accumulating into this blockade on March 2nd. And my take is,
Boris, what would be the sanctions or the pressure that you be, because
yes,
I
come to the
appreciate a
point.
lot the work and also the constant demands and coordination that you and your colleagues are doing, but I feel like we are at a point where this is not enough anymore, and a little bit what Simon pointed out. So what more can or should German government do now?
That was my next phrase. My take is that it's not sanctions that destabilize the entire security of Israel. I would personalize the frauds that are going on, the criminal actions that are going on. I would go for sanctions on the finance minister, on the defense minister, on the minister president himself, and enlarge or encourage the charges by the ICC, given that this kind of actions, that blockade, this is commanded by someone. This is a political decision maker that decided so, and that's where we should go. I'm not that much of a friend to, let's say, stop completely weapon delivery, because the security of Israel is still something we have to have in mind. I'm not fan of destabilizing the security of the country as such, and there is no such thing as offensive or defensive weapons. So this is something we have to really touch carefully. But to go for sanction on a personal level, or to have suspended the association agreements on trade with the European Union, this is something we should talk about.
Thank you very much. So now we're coming to our third and last round, which I try to keep very brief, and I would ask all of you to be quite to the point so that we also have some time for the questions from the audience. We want to focus a little bit on the way forward, recommendations. I mean, we've talked already a bit on it. This round, I would start with Mayrav maybe and ask, like, where do you see the decisive levers for exerting external pressure or influence on the Israeli government, especially like what can European states do to end the war, to get the hostages out, and of course to save people of Gaza from starvation? Or is there a lever of Europe, or is it basically only the US?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the things that Boris was just outlining are a start. I mean, I've been researching, the issue of sanctions and specifically regarding the West Bank and Israel's annexation of the West Bank. And, Biden put sanctions, and it was just the beginning. The problem is that even the association review, I mean, the fact that 17 voted to review it is a shift, but I don't think it's actually going to go through. The chance, and I'm not an expert on the EU policy, but I mean, this is my understanding that it would be very difficult for it to get through. So, also part of our work at Crisis Group is to come up with policy recommendations, but ones that are actually practical. So that's always a challenge. But I do think that the bottom line here is that, like many of you said, we need to reopen all the humanitarian aid, let it flow, and the discourse that has started in Europe is definitely a start, and I can't imagine that they're doing this without some kind of US coordination. And I do think that in some way, what we need is just for Trump to tell Netanyahu enough. And unfortunately, it does come down to that. And I hope that's going to happen. But even, when Trump was reelected, it was very clear to all of us that the EU has a real role to play, and the UK as well. They have to fill the vacuum. So Trump is very unexpected and unpredictable, and he's doing interesting things in the Middle East, and we don't know where it's going to go. But Europe has to step up now. And the ICC and the ICJ and all these issues have given Europe every possible opportunity to not just put their foot down in terms of what they're going to allow, but also what it means for their own reputations, own values. At this point, I think if you don't make real efforts to stop, and that could mean threatening withholding weapons for places like Germany and the UK, where actually they do provide weapons. If you don't go that step, I'm not sure at this point that Israel is going to stop. So on the one hand, I do think that the shift in the discourse is important, and that threats can maybe have an effect at this point because of the scale of the disaster, and because Israel has enjoyed impunity for so long on this issue, and not just in Gaza, that it needs to be backed up by serious leverage, serious action, with the hope that you may not have to use it, but you have to put it down. And also the whole discussion about recognizing Palestinian statehood, it means nothing if you don't put actual action plans on that. It just means nothing. And if you sanction ministers without taking any other action, those ministers will become more popular in Israel. So it has to come with action, and it isn't just dependent on Trump, but a lot of it is dependent, unfortunately, on what Trump decides to do.
Thank you, Mayrav. And I want to pass it on to Bushra. We have talked a lot about the demands, the admonitions from the international community to Israel that we have heard over months that are not translating into action, or not translating into effective protection and aid to civilians in Gaza. And of course, there's still an imminent threat of permanent displacement of large parts of the population. More and more human rights organizations and international scholars consider the way in which Israel wages its war as genocidal. And so even more pressing seems to be, what can we do right now? What can donors like Germany, like the EU, do to save the people in Gaza from starvation, and at least give them a horizon for a life in freedom, dignity, and peace?
Thank you. I mean, I think like everybody kind of said what I would say as well to the European Union, including Germany. So just from the donor perspective, I think like on this militarized plan, what's really important is that donors, one, they continue to support their partners on the ground and not question us on, well, you don't have it for operations, why should we continue funding you? Donors play a role here where they need to be working with us and helping us and supporting their partners in designing creative solutions so that we can continue our operations, and not only just continue our operations, even when our operations are very minimal. They need to understand and acknowledge that their funding is not only also supporting, of course, the provision of services and humanitarian assistance to affected communities, but right now we have 80 people in Gaza, 80 families. And a family in Gaza is not your traditional European family, one kid, two kids, parents. We're talking about families of 40, 50, 60 people. Their livelihoods would be cut off if our organizations are not there supporting them. That's number one. Number two is also continuing to support their Palestinian partners. This plan completely sidelines the Palestinian organizations, the civil society that we have, wanted to empower for decades. Now is your time to empower them. Now is your time to stick to those commitments of localization and empowering and building the resilience of affected communities and all the jargon that we use in our proposal. Now is your time to show up for those Palestinian frontline workers and continue to support them and find those creative solutions so that they can continue to work. It doesn't, again, humanitarian responses are not reduced to just distributing food. It's much more complex and holistic than this. And then donors need to also be very clear about them not funding the system, because I think it's very important to underline that they have not actually said that they will not fund. I mean, the statement from donors that came out, it didn't actually say that there's not going to be funded. They said they will not support it, but there's no actual commitment that they will not fund this. And I think it's really important that we get a really straight public commitment on this and pushback, even though donors have been great so far on pushing back on this. But then, of course, to Germany, simply for me, I understand that the impossibility of fathoming that the EU-Israeli trade agreement would be suspended, but that's the bare minimum. I mean, they did it within months with Russia. I mean, what is taking so long? All of the embassies in Tel Aviv are open. Everybody's embassy in Tel Aviv is operating when we're seeing absolute carnage in Gaza. And then, I mean, for me, again, the weapons, it's great. We need all of the crossings open. We need an uninterrupted flow of aid flooding Gaza. But that does not work if bombs are continuing to drop on our colleagues. So, we also need to stop the bombs. And of course, I mean, America being the biggest supplier of weapons is the most influential target. But I think that the global solidarity movement that has been relentless has also contributed to the shift that is happening in the European Union and across Europe. I think that needs to continue, that we need to show and expose the gap as well between what the street in Europe is saying and what their representatives that they've supposedly voted for are saying. Like, we need to expose that more and more. And I think it's quite blatant and flagrant at this point, and really plays to the credibility of these elected officials. So for me, the weapons piece and the EU-Israeli trade agreement piece, I mean, these are easy sells. And then, of course, the sanctions piece on this individual settlers is extremely important. But again, it doesn't protect me here in the West Bank. In fact, it might even rally up the settlers if they're sanctioned and, take revenge on us here. So I think also thinking through ways of what does a protective presence look like in Palestine, to protect these communities. I mean, 3 days ago, and posted they just came between two homes in a little village right outside of Mughayr, right outside of Ramallah, and just settled, and were threatening, harassing, burning the groves and the farmlands of the community, and 150 people were displaced, and nobody said a thing, and nobody even knows that this happened. So also, just exposing that, and one more thing, there's an ICJ advisory opinion that sets out clear tools and measures that states can actually take. It's actually like a handbook. So apply the handbook, apply by your legal obligations. Otherwise, these countries risk complicity, maybe not now, but in a couple of years, and in the long term, people will be coming after those states for complicity. Over.
Thank you, Bushra. And again, this brings me to Boris and Simon for asking for short answers. And you said ICJ advisory opinion. So this is international law, and many observers in the MENA region basically say Germany has double standards in relation to Israel and Gaza when it comes to international law, while in other conflicts they consistently advocate for human rights, international law. The German chancellor want to make possible that Netanyahu visits Germany despite an ICC arrest warrant. The German foreign minister voiced understanding for the blockade of aid when he visited Israel. And also Germany, or the German government right now, is blocking this review of the EU association agreement with Israel. So how does this go together, Boris, when it comes to international law and alleged violations of international law by Israel, where apparently, that's what observers and partners tell us, Germany has other standards than when it comes to violations from other countries?
So let me answer. First of all, nothing's easy in this region. There is no handbook to solve anything very quickly, and there is no solution tomorrow to be solved or done. So this is one thing that I would like to keep in mind, that we have been struggling and fighting with the situation for ages. Settlements are no longer a solution. So this would be a handover to Simon. Settlement politics of Israel in the West Bank has shown to get more troubles, more violations of law, more serious aggressive moments in history than it was the idea. So this is something we have to take serious. So a review of all relations with Israel is something to look at very closely and not easily jump on one. Let's say this is the measure we take, and then we have sanctions for settlement politics would be something to look at. I've been to West Bank. I've been seeing these kind of, in shrinking societies, etc. This is not the way that it can be co-living in the region. And this aggressive settlements need a red line as well. Secondly, double standards. I think the moment that Merz mentioned a couple of weeks ago that he would invite Netanyahu and meet him, unless he doesn't go to a transitional airport basis or wherever, Germany wouldn't never leave the ICC system. So two things of Second World War. One is we stand with Israel, of course, with a country, not with a person of a right-wing government, not with a single person that decides these kind of actions, but with the country. And the second thing is we need to fight impunity, and this is something we stand together with. I think Merz wouldn't repeat this kind of invitation, but I'm not him. I'm not defending the chancellor. I'm just defending the ICC system. Coming back to double standards, of course, we need clear voices, but we also have to see that we have more criminal actions here in Germany with anti-Semitic backgrounds. So we have to fight also the situation we have within our country that Jewish people cannot live their living. So this is something very sensitive. I know this is nothing compared to the situation in the Middle East. And I know this is very specific to Germany and to German history, but this is something we have to deal with as well. And this gives us the situation that we look very closely to what we do. I wouldn't call it double standards. I would say this is something we have to be very careful what we say. But for the moment, and this is what the blockade showed very clearly, this kind of we give a little and then we take all back, etc. And this kind of aggressive politics of Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Katz, Mr. Ben-Gvir, Mr. Smotrich, these kind of guys, I would like to invite to the ICC to get really clear what is wrong and right in this context.
Thank you, Boris. And maybe a last question before opening to the questions from the audience. Simon, do you see any concrete entry points for enforcing the obligations under international law, especially like the ban on using hunger as a weapon of war? Where can or should Germany and the EU start in order to be able to, of course, independently investigate? I mean, this might be a first step, which is also not possible because no foreign journalist is allowed to go into Gaza, and also no independent missions to investigate on alleged human rights violations can go to Gaza, but also to punish possible violations of international law by Israel, but of course also by Hamas. I mean, it's a law there for everyone. And the question to me, like, do you see entry points and where would they be?
Yeah, I mean, some of the points are now a little repetition of what colleagues here said. I think now is the moment really to support NGOs and their monitoring capabilities in Gaza. What we are trying to do on a very small basis, but to documentate the violations and be able to have the evidence ready in front of courts. Then, of course, support the ICC, the International Criminal Law system, by the EU and Germany. This court is being attacked left, right, and center, basically by Israel, by the US, with laws that are aimed to defund them. The EU and Germany should step up funding right now, and also political and technical support for the investigations. There's also a possibility in Germany to invoke universal jurisdiction. The public prosecutor could open cases against perpetrators of war crimes in Germany. I know this is probably a bit far-fetched, but this is how it should be. And then support humanitarian corridors and airdrops. Even, we're at this point, we've seen the failure, unfortunately, of the Biden idea of having a little humanitarian harbor in Gaza, but given the desperation of the situation, maritime corridors or airdrops should not be ruled out, and should be actually followed through by European actors. But I think in general, we just have, as Europeans, we just have to formulate our own policy, right? Like, where are we? Honestly, might have said it very clearly. It all comes down to like our last hope. It seems to be like that Trump talks to Netanyahu. That's not a policy or a plan, you know. So the Europeans, and we're seeing this. We're seeing more and more regional European efforts and groups of European states coming together. But it's not yet everyone, and it's not yet enough. But there's a few good initiatives by France, by the UK, together with Canada. The Netherlands are moving. Germany too slow still, and too cautious and cowardish. But I think this is where it should go in this direction. And only then we can actually support our claims and make sure that we're serious about what we're talking about and serious about international law.
Thank you, Simon. And with that being said, now it's your turn as audience. So we are now opening the discussion to your question. I see there are already quite some questions in the Q&A, and feel free to add further questions. We don't have a lot of time, so I will pick and choose the questions I see as most relevant and pose them to our panelists. You can ask in German and in English, feel free. And I would maybe start with a first selection that I would read 3 questions, and then you can see and choose and pick them, and feel free to respond. So we have one question from Amelie Overman from Bread for the World. She's asking, what is the situation in the West Bank? How do people react to the increased IDF operations in the West Bank? Maybe this relates also to what we said about settlers, new settlements, outposts. Then we have a second question that is on sanctions, saying that particularly targeted sanctions on individual Israeli ministers are good, but they have a long-term effect rather than an immediate one. So time is running out for the people of Gaza. What should happen right now? So what are things that could help immediately, because it's a matter rather of days to save people from starvation? Then a third question in this row is, what are concrete forms of support for humanitarian relief that individuals in Germany, in Europe can undertake? And I think it refers especially to crowdfunding campaigns of individuals. Is this something that helps? Of course, it helps individuals, but can this replace or add to what humanitarian organizations are doing? And now I would, whoever wants to start, feel free to start and pick and choose a question.
To just reflect on these. I mean, to do right now, I think we've said it. I mean, for me, it's if weapons were to stop right now, we wouldn't have people dying in Gaza. And I know it seems maybe far-fetched, but it shouldn't be so far-fetched. It should be very simple to be able to do that. I think, you know, right now is, you know, not just statements of condemnation, like real pressure and real actions from member states. Now is their time. Now is their time to shine. Now they need to stand on the right side of history, and understand that that's the position that they need to take, and acknowledge that. So I think like that's extremely important. And stop also, I think what you said, Mayrav, on the two-state solution and, you know, peace kind of discussions. I mean, we're so far from that. That, you know, we really need to address the root causes. And humanitarians and human rights organizations have been very clear on what needs to happen. I think it's just about political will. But then just on the crowdfunding campaigns, I mean, again, it can't rest. I mean, meeting the needs of 2.2 million people, it cannot rest on humanitarian organizations. We can't meet the needs. Never in any context or in any circumstance will we be able to meet the needs of 2.2 million people. We need commercial trucks. We need to revive the Palestinian economy in Gaza. We need to revive the businesses because they support the humanitarian operations. Because, for example, my colleagues can at least go purchase things in the markets and not rely on aid assistance because they've got salaries and they can afford to go to the markets. But that's non-existent in Gaza. So I think supporting people through the fundraising campaigns is an excellent way. I've run many over the last two years. I continue to run them in my personal capacity for my family, for my friends, and I think it's an excellent way to support people in Gaza. If you're able to do that, I really encourage you. But also continuing to support the principled humanitarian actors that are there. The UNRWA, continuing to fund UNRWA as well. Like it's they have 13,000 salaried people that are ready to work. They are providing the services to the Gazan population and have been for decades. So I think like supporting all of these initiatives and the principled humanitarian actors, and please carry out your due diligence as well on who you're supporting when it comes to humanitarian actors, because there's many informal ones as well in Gaza that are not, part of the humanitarian kind of infrastructure and are operating, for example, in the hubs. And we should not, be supporting. These are not humanitarian. They're actors, but they're not humanitarian in any way.
Thank you. Simon, you want to comment on the West Bank and what's happening there, or anyone else wants?
Yeah, sure. I can quickly go. I mean, the situation in the West Bank is pretty dire, and I mean, Bushra lives there and can probably even better tell us about it firsthand. But I've been there recently twice, and when the first ceasefire actually took effect, when Trump came in end of January, we saw almost immediately an increase in settler violence and demolition orders, and IDF actually extending their operations in the West Bank. So it was horrible. And there's 40,000 displaced people from mostly the Jenin refugee camp in the north. I remind everyone also, these are people that have been displaced since 1948 already, of when the Nakba happened, and they were basically driven out of their homes and houses. Of course, this is a long time ago, and many of these refugee camps are now informal housing and districts, but they're being again displaced and their houses demolished, contrary to international law. So this is a very urgent situation. What I otherwise just the discrimination and unequal treatment of your everyday Palestinian citizen is just crazy in the West Bank, and we see up to 1,000 new checkpoints since the beginning of the year. Many of them flying checkpoints. The Israeli army is also closing down now cities and villages, so that when there's an incident in a given city, people from the other city or village cannot come to help or support. So this is what we're seeing: increased settler expansion also in Jerusalem and Bethlehem area. This is the everyday reality that needs to stop immediately.
I would start with the second round of questions, except Mayrav and Boris want to comment on one of the questions. If it's fine, then I have one specifically to Mayrav from Jörn Böhme from the New Israel Fund. He's asking that the chairperson of the party, the Green Party, Felix Banaszak, claimed that Israel, since its founding, has been existentially threatened, and that it is surrounded by countries who don't mean well towards Israel. What is your take on this statement? Is it true that Israel was always been surrounded by enemies and is existentially threatened? So this would be the first question. Then I collect another one that is specifically for Boris. It's someone asking that you described how back then you tried to make possible that more trucks reached Gaza, and that also under the green-led foreign ministry from Annalena Baerbock, there were many efforts to try to get more aid in. But as this were not very successful, that's what the person is writing. Why were there no political consequences or sanctions drawn from this back then when the Greens were still in government? So this is this question. And then I had a last one, right? That's a question like, how can individuals put more pressure on their respective governments to act. So probably individuals in Germany, I suppose, or in Europe, what needs to be done that governments are more responsive to what populations think about the conflict. And now I would give it maybe to Mayrav and Boris, and then Bushra and Simon could add if they want.
So, I mean, I think that question is a bit jarring when you have a situation in which Israel is killing so many Palestinians on such a disproportionate level. But I will say that, you know, even the military experts who have dedicated their lives to Israeli security have spoken many, many times about how the fact that, you know, even Iran is not the biggest threat to Israel, that the biggest threat to Israel is its own existential issues with itself about its Jewish and democratic character, the fact that it's never really decided what its borders are. I mean, it has troops now in Lebanon and Syria, in addition to Gaza and the West Bank. And Israel is going through a real crisis, a political deadlock crisis for years now, and it's coming to a head with the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. But I would just say that, you know, the two countries that Israel was very much at war with, Jordan and Egypt, now has peace treaties with that have lasted even through what we're seeing in Gaza today. And so it's a pretty clear empirical evidence of the fact that the way to avoid catastrophe and war and attacks on your borders is to negotiate diplomatic solutions. And in those diplomatic solutions, you don't always get exactly what you want, but you get a lot more peace and stability. And so that's my takeaway for that question.
Thank you. And then Boris, on this question, why didn't the last old government didn't impose more sanctions or pressure on Israel, if I got it right?
Yeah, I will do, but let me just say Iran is still a threat in the region, just to be very clear about that. About the trucks, we've been fighting for the trucks a long time, and we have been successful. A lot of people from the foreign ministry have been in the region working, dealing on diplomatic level, getting support to get food in. I remember last year there were the commercial trucks of Israel in competition. We had different border situations. We could manage to have deals that this medicine, food, etc. gets in. But the situation has dramatically changed since the blockade and the couple of weeks before that. And we need now to face that this existing second foundation or second actor is undermining the UN system. This is something that is the bigger threat to our work, to the work we have been supporting so far. If the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation replaces, people get closer to military action, closer to danger, closer to situations where you can steer, where you get politicization of humanitarian aid. This is something we really have to face as a problem all over the world, and especially in Gaza. Let me just answer the question on the financial situation. The problem is not for the food. Like I said, it's 100,000 tons of food surrounding, and it's waiting to get in. The question is the corridors to access and to get in. And this is something we need to internationally demand as well. Investigations, what is going on into Gaza. Simon has been talking about documentation. This is something we really need to enlarge, to demand as well. But we need open humanitarian corridors that have been closed down due to, let's say, disclosure of activities. This is something that is a charge. This is something that needs to end. And this is something where I expect my government to go closer to Israel and say, guys, we need to open these doors to get the food that is already there, to get it in. The monetary situation of the UN system is another topic. This is really dramatic. I can only encourage individuals to spend whatever they have to WFP and to any NGO that is working there as well.
Thank you, Boris. If you want some last words, Bushra and Simon, feel free, but you're not obliged to. But go ahead.
I just
Can I
want
add?
to say,
Yeah, please.
sorry, Simon, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bushra. It's okay.
I just want to say, I think for regular folks to continue doing what we've been seeing, the great protest, the Red Line protest that was organized by Oxfam and 100 other civil society organizations in the Netherlands was extremely powerful. And believe me, it gives hope to Palestinians to see the people of Europe on the street marching against this and not stopping that. It really does. It is, to the regular Palestinian, it's the only hope we have, because we definitely feel abandoned by states and by the entire world, but we see the people marching and speaking out and being brave. And I think, like, at this point where Palestinian mothers are losing their children, Dr. Ala, a pediatrician in Al Nasser hospitals 2 days ago, she lost 8 out of her 9 children in one blow and couldn't recognize them because they were completely charred and dismembered. If this woman, Dr. Ala, was able to go through that, the least we can do is speak out and be brave about speaking out. I think that's the really bare minimum for the people on, regular people in Europe. And then one more thing, tell the story of Palestinians. It's so important to not talk actually about in trucks, number of trucks, because number of trucks actually don't dignify us. It doesn't give the dignity of Palestinians. Palestinians is really rich culture of generosity. It's people that are really open and warm. They love music and they love food, and we have an extremely diverse pop culture and population. Talk about the Palestinians so that we are not erased by the policies and the politics and the key messaging and the advocacy points and all of that, and that those stories that really do matter and that really do resonate are also continue to be told. I think that that's also important to center the voices of Palestinians. So I really appreciate you also inviting me as a way of also doing that in one way or another.
Thank you so much, Bushra. Simon, a last word?
Yeah, that was almost actually a perfect final statement. Bushra, I can only completely echo that. And when I talk to partners, and Palestinian friends, it is really what you just said. This international solidarity movement around the world is really actually everything they have at the moment to protect Palestinians, because obviously Hamas or the PA are not protecting Palestinians, let alone Israel or the international community or the European Union. So this is really important to keep it up and to tell the stories and defend. And then in terms of steps, I think the very first priority, of course, is the humanitarian aid that needs to enter. The second step is really, and this is what partners of ours have been telling me over and over again, an end of this war, not another ceasefire, an end of this war. And the third thing then is an end of occupation, a stop of the occupation, and then this would put actually both sides in the position to actually start and come on a process of what would hopefully be called a peace process. But this is this has to happen first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's rich topics where we could continue talking for a long time, but we've reached the end of today's event. Thank you so much for coming and joining the discussion. I hope you could enjoy, if you could enjoy this topic, but at least enjoy it to the fact that we had a more nuanced and maybe objective debate about what's happening in Gaza. And above all, what I hope is that this discussion, but also many other discussions on the streets, in universities, in parliaments, will help to ensure that people in Gaza can finally live in peace and dignity again. And of course, also that the hostages are released and that there is a perspective which we don't see right now. So many thanks to our technical team, the translators, for the great support, and above all, 1,000 thank you to our great panelists. Thank you for being with us. I wish you all a wonderful evening and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.